Isn't it unbelievable? Hello everybody and welcome to another camera class. My name is Saxon, and in today's class, also apologize for being late. I had to take care of a few people on our sales floor, but I am here. Today we're doing intermediate camera knowledge. Let me blow this up so my in-class people can see. But as always, everybody, thanks for joining. Today we're going to go through intermediate camera knowledge. We're graduating from our basic automatic settings that we really talked about last week. And rather than talk about the simplicity, framing the image and anything else, we're going to get into the more complex parts about what makes a camera so unique and special. So we'll be talking about things like shutter, f-stop, and ISO, as well as lenses today. That'll be a big conversation that we have too. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. So I think last week we talked about why we upgrade from our cell phone into a camera. And for a lot of people, when they're using a camera, they will just use the automatic setting because it's less thinking, it's more action, you take your shot, you get the picture right away. And nowadays too, with the cameras being so technologically advanced, you really get an amazing picture from using the automatic settings of your camera. There's no doubt about it. But going more advanced means that we're putting more power or control into our possession. We are becoming more masterful of the camera, and we're really dictating how and what our shot is. And I think that's a really important thing in photography for both an artistic standpoint, but then also just someone who wants to capture maybe the beauty or the intricacy of whatever they're taking pictures of. If you take a picture of a leaf, there's veins to the leaf, there's different shades of green, there might be a sheen, or maybe might be a little bit of transparency. And if you're using an automatic setting, you might not pick up on that information of something like a leaf, but if you're using more advanced settings on your camera, you really can start to pick up on really cool and powerful parts of your subject matter image. So the first thing I like to talk about is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. When we think about a snapshot, we should be thinking about something that is not necessarily simple, but it's a quick image. It's not meant to be anything too complex. For example, if you're here in the store, we have an escalator that leads up, and as you're going up the escalator, we have this nice little mural on the ceiling of all of these Chicago skyscrapers and a nice blue sky. It's really cool looking, and I like to take pictures of it randomly when I go up the stairs. I think it's really cool. So this was something that I took on my camera with an automatic setting. I didn't change any settings on there. I didn't check any of my details on there. I just pointed the camera and then shot the photo. Didn't really even let it focus too much either. Now, I consider this to be a snapshot because it's a quick one image, not much thought. I then took this image with my camera and I changed my settings on there, and this is what came out of the camera. I didn't alter the color, I didn't change anything else. But naturally, because I lowered certain numbers and I opened myself up a little bit more, and I also made sure it was level, you can really see the difference between going from something that was quick versus doing something that has a little bit more thought process to it and has a little bit more deliberate purpose. That, in my opinion, is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph, and the things we talk about today hopefully will lead into how you can take something very simple and turn it from this into something more like this. So the first step on all of these is to learn your camera. And I think last week we really went through that by talking about the buttons and the dials and what this all means and how you can start to learn from just using that. As we also talked about, the owner's manual is about 1,000 pages thick, so it's hard to get through in one go. But you can see that Canon has a large assortment of cameras. Nikon has a large assortment. Sony has a lot. There's not one camera out there, and it's important to remember that there's a camera for everyone's budget, but I do always recommend the more that you can put into your photography, the more you'll benefit from it. That's why I do like that Benjamin Franklin quote I showed last week, but photography is all about having your, investing the money into the gear, because it goes a long way when it comes to quality and everything else. I like to talk about editing software a little bit in this, though it's not necessary. We don't really talk about it till next week with advanced camera class. Editing is an important part of your photo enthusiasm, if you will. It's a big step of the game. The way I look at it is that when you take a picture, that is about 30 to 40% of the job done. The last 60% is then actually editing the photo or the video and then putting it into whatever form of presentation or whatever your end result may be, whether that's printing the image or sharing the image with colleagues, family, loved ones, or just preserving the image in a hard drive of some sort. All of that are the finishing steps. So these are editing softwares that I really like. I think the Adobe series is some of the best out there. Photoshop and Lightroom are my two favorites. And what I will tell people, and what I always do mention, if you just want to change the color of your photo, or you want to edit certain things that we talk about next week, nothing too serious, Lightroom is probably the best thing for you. You make it very straightforward, very streamlined, and it's very easy to upload all of your photos to edit. Photoshop is a little bit more advanced in the sense that if you want to really get rid of details, or if there's things you want to remove from the image, Photoshop gives you that ability to really do some hard edits on your photo. Rather, the Lightroom is more of like what it says, Lightroom. When you would edit your photos under a 35mm projector, you'd sit there and dodge and burn with various shapes and cutouts. That's very similar to what Lightroom allows you to do. And we'll talk more about photo editing later. But Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro are both really good websites and programs too. If I'm not mistaken, both of them actually are a one-time payment, so you don't have to keep paying monthly for them. I think you pay about $200 to $300 up front, and then that's it. You never have to pay again. Whereas Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom, they don't sell versions anymore where you get Series 1 or version 2. What they do is they sell you a monthly subscription, and then they continuously edit and update those apps as you're going. So again, give or take on what you prefer. Now, getting into the more advanced settings, we'll talk about the mode dial again. And I think last week I referred to this as the driving of a car. It's your way of switching from, it's your gear shifter. It's your way of moving from park to drive to manual, etc. This is the same thing that is controlling your camera. So depending on what setting you put this on, that's what the camera is going to allow for. So last week we really talked about auto, and we talked maybe a little bit about the P, which is usually program auto, which gives you all the automatic settings that you're used to. The big difference on that camera or on the program settings that there's things you're able to change, like your metering mode, or your area for autofocus, or your ability to autofocus. That's all stuff that you can change. Today, we're mainly going to be focusing on the manual, aperture, and shutter priorities. And I think I have on the next slide, I kind of call them all out. Yeah. So your next steps. We've really talked about automatic and program auto. Those two are basically the same. The other one that we talked about was scenes, which I'm not going to mention today because I don't think they're necessary to use, and most cameras don't have them like yours do. Don't have them. But aperture priority, shutter priority, and the full manual settings. So aperture priority is control of just your aperture settings. Shutter is going to control the speed at which the shutter is closing and opening. And then your full manual is control over both of those, plus your ISO if you choose to do so. Now, ISO is a tricky one, and we'll talk more about that as we keep going forward, but ISO is one of those settings that no matter what setting you're on the camera, ISO can either be automatic or you can continuously change your ISO depending on what you need. Me personally, and I'll talk about that when we get there. So the thing we're going to look at right now to start this whole thing off is the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is the foundational basis of where and how you're doing what you're doing. So typically, if you update your aperture, you will also have to change the shutter. And if you change the shutter, you're going to have to change the ISO. And it's a little bit of a song and dance between the three of them, because what you're doing is you're configuring your camera to have the best settings possible for whatever the image that you're taking. So to really get into it, let's start with your aperture priority. Aperture controls depth of field, or controls the relationship between your background and your foreground. Now, when we talk about background to foreground relationship, what we're talking about is what our viewer, or what the subject, or whoever's looking at our photos can see. The bigger the number, the smaller the iris. The smaller the number, the bigger the iris. And the way to think about it is with your human eyes. When you're going in and out of outdoors, when there's a lot of sun, our eye, technically, the little black part, wants to get really small because it doesn't need to let so much light in because we can see so much. And what happens is when you go from somewhere super light to super dark, sometimes it's really hard to see what you're doing because your eye takes time to adjust. On the flip side though, if you're in an extremely dark place, your iris will open up fully and you're going to see everything that's possible to see, but then if you go into a bright place, it's going to hurt. And that's in a way similar to how aperture works, but the reason that we're doing it is not for letting light in necessarily, it's more for that control of background-foreground relationship. Now, that's not to say it doesn't affect light, because it does, and that's where then changing shutter and ISO comes into play. But we can see at the f22 number that our stick figure and the pyramids are both in focus. We can see both of them. They're both on display. Great for landscape pictures, great for things where, and the way I like to word it is if you go on vacation with the missus or the grandkids or somebody else, and you want to take a picture of the two of you in front of your cruise ship that you're on. You don't want to use something with a low number because you're not going to see the cruise ship in the background. You want to do something with a higher number so to get both your foreground and your background into focus. As you continuously lower the number, you start to notice that the background blurs out until you can almost not even make out the background anymore. Typically, if you're buying a lens, the higher cost lenses usually have different coating measures and all this other technology within the glass, but what you're really paying for is that f1.4, f1.2, f1.8. Those are some of the lowest numbers you can get on a fixed millimeter lens. And we'll talk about what a fixed versus a zoom lens means when we get to lenses. With zoom lenses, the lowest that you can go, at least that I have seen, have been 2. I've seen very pricey lenses that can get down to an f2 that have a zoom to them. But typically, the lowest that you'll really see is f2.8. And that's just because the amount of glass and the amount of other pieces that would have to be inside the lens would, number one, drive your lens cost up to multi-thousands of dollars, but then number two, it would be very heavy. Typically, with lenses, the lower the f-stop is, the wider the circumference of the lens will be too. And you'll notice that as you walk around the lens department, you look for those 1.2, 1.8s, you're going to see that the glass on the top is very wide, as opposed to the smaller ones, they're more narrow. So again, aperture, the higher the number, the more that you get with the background and the foreground relationship, the lower the number, the more you're blurring out the background and focusing it on a subject matter. You'll see a lot of people get the 1.4, the 1.2, or the 1.8. They're more wedding photographers or professional portrait photographers. Their goal is to capture the subject matter in front of them. They don't really care too much about the background. So some examples that I have to kind of show this off. We'll look at the left image first with our dogs. We have this maybe golden retriever or Labrador in the front there. We can see their noses in full focus, and we can see all the wrinkles, the details, the crevices, and even the individual hair follicles all around it. But as we then look, we can see that the dog in the background is pretty blurred out, but not blurred out to the point where we can't make out that it's another dog. So we can tell that that's a dog behind another dog. So if we go back to our last slide, we're probably sitting somewhere close to the f5.6 and maybe f8. f8 might still be a little too sharp for what we're looking at. If we go back to the image, maybe even an f5.6 or 4. Could even be a little bit closer to 4. But again, we can make out the dog's face, we can tell it's a dog, we can see the pink collar, we just don't have clear focus of it. Our main focus is on the nose. Now move that over to our squirrel on the other hand, and we can see the squirrel is in perfect focus, even some of the wood that they're standing on. But the background being probably more foliage, more trees, more, it looks like an evergreen tree with the little stuff coming off of there. We can't see any of that. So we can make out the colors, but we can't make out the actual iconography behind the actual squirrel. So if we go back, that's probably sitting closer on an f2, f1.4. So we're fully blurring out the background to the point where you can't really tell exactly what it is. The only thing you have are colors and the blurred shapes. So that's a good way of understanding aperture on there. The other thing aperture is really good for is our bokeh effect. bokeh is an effect that you can get with your lens depending on the f-stop. Typically you need a really low number, like a 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. And if you look at these little dots behind it, those are Christmas lights. But because we have blurred the focus so much and drawn our attention to our little minifig, the only thing that we're really getting in detail is the minifig, and everything else behind it becomes so blurred out that we can really only make its essence out. And so in this case, we just get our little circles, our little lights. So I like to use this picture as a good example for why do we use the aperture priority mode. So this isn't even about manual, this isn't just about using the aperture priority on your camera. And the reason might be that you have a shot like this, where you have a beautiful background displayed behind the subject matter, and you not only want to get the subject matter in full focus, but you also want to capture the beauty of the background, or just want to capture the image as a whole. If, let's say, she was standing in front of a brick wall, and we didn't think the brick wall helped her at all, we could then go down to that 1.2, 1.4, blur the background out, and make our subject matter just our model that's standing in the front there. That's kind of the understanding of what aperture is going to do for you. It's that relationship that you're creating in your image between the foreground and the background, and then how those relate or how those separate from each other, depending on the aperture number that you're at. And then to review again. So if you were to go out and you take 5 or 6 pictures of the same thing, a test that you can do with that is just to go through and change the number as you go. You'll see that whatever you're focusing on should stay in focus. Use it with a tripod, you don't have to if it's not possible. But this is a great example. You have a blue garbage can, probably at a forest preserve somewhere or by a public park. You've got a body of water, some grass or some tall grass, if you will, and then a nice tree in the background too. But that garbage can is distracting. It's blue, it's a different color from everything else. So you probably would want to blur that out if you really wanted this image. F16, it blurs it out, but not quite. You can still make out that there's something there. Maybe it's a car, maybe it's not a garbage can, you just can't tell. F6.3, you really can't tell, and honestly I think that that is enough where you're blurring the image out, but you really can't see whatever that is over there, but that blue still kind of comes through a little bit and you can see it. F2.8, now you've lost the whole background. You can only make out that there's something brown over there, some green, and then you've got something that's dark, but the garbage can that was there now becomes almost invisible, and the main part, that little tree trunk that we've got there, is the main thing that's actually in focus right now. So it's a really nice way of being able to separate the foreground from the background, blur things that are unwanted in the image, and just focus on your main subject matter if that's what you're going for. The next thing to talk about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is the speed at which your shutters are closing and opening. And typically when we talk about shutter speed, we talk about it in relation to 1 second. So when you see a number like 1/500, 1/250, that is 1/500th of a second, 1/250th of a second. I hate pronouncing all of those out loud. I think it's such a, so I'll tell people, oh, set it to 250, set it to 500. That's me and how I put it out there. But the idea with this one is that we have a stick figure that's running. They're in motion. So as they're in motion, we need to slow their motion down in order to get a crisp image. So let's say they're doing a light jog, you're at the Chicago Marathon and you're taking pictures of people as they're running. You might raise your shutter speed up on shutter priority to ensure that you get that image. Because if you get anything that's blurry, it's not going to look right. And I have some examples where that can be challenged, but the primary focus of you wanting to get someone who's working out or running or moving is to capture a still image of them as they blaze past or as they do whatever they're doing. So 1/500th of a second is pretty quick. We have the runner in full focus. 1/250th and 1/125th of a second is also pretty crisp too. We can see that they're still in full focus. They're starting to get, from my view, where I'm at on the screen, starting to get a little bit loose on the edges by the legs and the arms. Usually, it's whatever the fastest part of the body is, that's when we start to lose focus of first. So if you're taking a picture of a runner, you might get the runner in perfect form, and then all of a sudden you see his arms are all wiggly and blurry. And that's because as that shutter speed gets slower and slower, those are the things that are going to become more apparent until you get really slow, like at 1/30th of a second, and now you're seeing almost a double figure. And when you get to 1/15th, now you've got two figures. And then same and so forth as you continue to go down. It gets more blurry and blurry. Not only does it get blurry, but you'll notice that the figure starts to become more washed out as you're going. And that's because the camera doesn't have the time to focus to get the details and the colors and everything else when the shutter speed's too slow and the object is moving. Now there are examples that I have of long form photography, and I'll put that on the next slide too. But the idea of shutter is to capture movement. You're trying to make sure that you're using the appropriate shutter to get the exact speed or movement of whatever the figure or whatever the subject matter is. If we're doing sports photography, if we're doing heavy action photography, to freeze that action, realistically, you need to be at a shutter speed of 1/1000th or faster. Typically, I had a mother who came in and she wanted to take pictures of her kids playing hockey. And when you're playing hockey, you're moving very quickly. The puck is moving, you've got the stick. It's a lot of fast movement. So in order to make sure that you're capturing that to the best of your ability, I told her to use a speed of at least 1/1200th of a second because of how fast they were moving and also because of how bright everything is. You want to make sure that you're getting a good amount of light in there. So we talked about aperture priority, and I didn't think that was necessary. I leaned on shutter priority. She got some really great pictures from what she sent me. But using the freezing action, we can see that our surfer is in full focus right now. The parts that aren't are the water. We can see the blur and everything else on the water. Now the reason being is the water and all its molecules and little bits are going to be moving much faster than the surfer. The surfer, for the most part, is still in motion, he's still moving, but by doing that 1/1000th speed, we're able to just focus on the surfer, our main part of the subject matter, and the water, while still blurry, looks really cool because you can see where parts are being frozen and droplets and everything. It looks very action-packed and it's full. Other reasons we like to use it is it gives a sense of motion. So my hummingbird is one of my favorite things. I personally have not been able to photograph one myself, but anytime I get a birder who comes in, I immediately have to ask. So this was from one of my people that bought a camera from me, and they were doing bird photography, and I told them if you get a picture of a hummingbird, please send that to me. I want to use it as an example. Hummingbirds have this tendency of their wings will flap very quickly and very fast to keep their bodies in motion, but their body as a whole will stay still perfectly. They barely move, and you barely can see the wings flutter. It's really incredible. So by taking a picture at 1/1000th of a second or faster, I'm able to get that beautiful body in full focus, where I can see the red of the beak, the nice yellow coloration on the feathers, even where the green starts to come in, and the browns too, and the blue notes on there that you're likely able to see. But where my motion really comes in is the wings. There's a slight blur on the wings. It's a little bit of noise that's on there, but it's still a beautiful image because of how nice the color and everything else is so rich on there. So it's okay to have a little bit of blurriness in your photos when it comes to motion. Your goal is to obviously not have a 100% blurry image. But if there's parts that show a little bit more movement than others, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You're giving a sense of motion within your photography, so people know that this wasn't just, a dead bird, for lack of a better term, hung by a string. They can tell that this was a moving bird. It's got a bug in its mouth, so it caught something to eat, and its wings are moving so fast that while we weren't able to get them still, we were able to get the beauty of the rest of the bird, which I think is important. Now, the other thing we could do with shutter speed priority is long exposures. Now, long exposures are a great way to get the most detail out of an image possible. But the other thing to be wary of is that by having your shutter open for so long, you leave your camera prone to blurring. And what I mean by that is make sure that whatever you're doing with that camera, you're focusing on stabilization. So for example, this picture of a waterfall was taken over, and I forgot exactly which rainforest it was at, but it was in a rainforest preserve of some sort, I think in Puerto Rico. Basically, when they were taking the photo, they had a tripod set up and they had the camera onto the tripod. By doing that, they were able to then set their speed of it to be longer. So, and when I say longer, I'm not talking about a minute, I'm not talking about 2 minutes, I'm more talking about 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds. That's a long enough time, but a very long time for the camera to keep its shutters open without having any stabilization. If you try to set your camera's shutter speed to the lowest one possible, see what the lowest setting, or the slowest setting, I should say, that you can get to before your hand starts to really show a shaky quality in there. But by doing long exposure, we get a lot more detail out of the foliage on this one. We can see the moss on the rocks really well, and we can see the deep different parts of where the black and then the gray of the rock and some of that brown tone really come through. And we can see all of that small little details, and the texture comes out beautifully too. The water too has a really nice pattern. You can see these very elongated colors that are coming through, where the white of the water and sheen goes for a long time. That's because the water is naturally flowing down this little waterfall in a repetitive fashion. So it's basically flowing in the same spot. The parts that are blurry are the places where the water might start to splash in certain areas that it's not constantly flowing through. So my example, the water's coming down right here at the top of the waterfall, but we can see that there's this white little aura that goes around it like a ghost. And that's only because there's particles that are flying in all bits and places that it's not normally falling into. Areas like the foliage and the greenery up here all look perfect and vibrant and bright because they're not moving. They're staying in one spot, and because of that, the camera's able to read that information and absorb all of that it can. So long exposures are great for creating mood, they're great for creating dramatization, they're great for just kind of drawing certain features or vibrancy out of your photos. Where with the faster photos that you're taking, that's a great way of getting motion, of detecting motion. Another example of a long exposure, you have this gentleman who's at a train station, he's got the bike set up, the roof, the bike, himself, the platform, all of that is in perfect focus. We can see all of the details, the water damage on the ceiling, some of the piping, the light has a nice tone to it. Even his bike, we can see the dirt underneath the bike, that's in focus, that's got detail. The train that's in front of him is moving at a great speed, or at least we see it as speed, as motion. But what's crazy about it is because the train is moving in a linear fashion, the actual parts in between the train, there's the gaps that then connect all the rail cars. There's enough space in those that we can actually see through the train and read the buildings right behind it. And you can kind of see whatever exists behind, even some of the trees, and who knows what else is back there. So long exposure can not only give you a nice sense of motion and bring out a vibrancy of colors, but can also give you things like this that you're not going to see on your average photo. So this is an example. This was sent to me by a customer. Why do we use shutter priority? It's for moments like this, where you have things that are moving in speed or motion, and we see that that's moving. We want to make sure that we're setting our camera to the appropriate shutter priority, so that way we're not getting something that looks blurry, that doesn't look right. If they would have gone a little bit faster, they probably would have gotten the throw really nicely without getting this double version of the person they were trying to take a picture of. This is ultimate frisbee. Photo looks, for the most part, would have been probably fine, but because they did it so slow, they weren't able to get that speed right. Another good example of using something with motion, this would have probably be done at about at least 1/1200th of a second just to capture that right, and you really only get one chance with this. The other thing that we could probably mention within this, and I don't have a slide for it unfortunately, is burst photography, where you're taking multiple images at a time. So you're basically shooting 10 images at 1 second. That's a great way of also getting down the right frame, because as you're going and taking photos, you might notice that as you're taking a photo, it still comes out blurry even if you have the right speed set. But by allowing the camera to take 10 pictures at once, there should be a chance that out of those 10, one is in perfect focus and frame. So that's where a good time to use your burst photography or use the burst mode on your camera might be necessary. Now, ISO, or ISO as a lot of people call it, there's a full technical name for it. It's very long name, and I always forget it. One of these days I'm going to put it on a slide and remember to do it. But ISO is a great way for you to bring more light in. And the best way I can describe ISO is back in the day when you had film, you would buy film from your store, and it would basically say Kodak 400, Kodak 100, Ilford 800. That is the sensitivity towards light of the camera. And with that being said, in the digital world, because we don't have the film, but we do have that little sensor square on the back of the camera, the ISO is the sensitivity of that sensor and how much light is being brought into the camera. Now again, your aperture priority, your shutter priority, that's all a part of how much light comes in and out of the camera. But ISO is also going to dictate how much light the actual sensor is absorbing. So I like this image because it really breaks it down nicely. ISO 100, we can see that our bridge is very dark. The color of the sky is pretty mundane, but it's there. It's kind of cotton candy-like. We can see that's water, but we have very intense black shadows underneath that. Even on the beach, we have very, very dark colors. Move over to ISO 200. The sky is really nice. Now we're getting a much more creamy texture. We're seeing more of those colors pop through. The beach gets a little bit more illuminated. Even underneath the bridge and the water in that area, a little bit more light. We move to ISO 400, and now we really can start to see all of the different colors, more of these blue tones and purple tones coming in the top there. We get a little bit of red in the bottom corner that we picked up over there too. Now it's a little bit more elaborate. But again, that beach is now starting to lighten up. The water underneath the bridge is starting to really lighten up. Moving then to 800, and now we have a very vibrant sky. Things are very bright. The dock and the pier itself, we can start, if you look real closely, you can see that's not 100% black. There's other shades of colors in there. As well too, our beach is a little bit lighter, and then the water and the waves itself have much more vibrancy to them. So playing with ISO, it can be something simple or very complex, but the way I look at it is mood, it's creating drama, it's the amount of light you want to be on your image. ISO can't be changed later on. Exposure compensation can be changed later on. You can always make something brighter, in my opinion, or you could always make a brighter image darker. It's sometimes harder to make a brighter image, or a darker image bright. Yes. So, ISO though also equates to noise, and it's important that we put those two things together, because some people will see a really dark image and they'll want to jack their ISO up as high as the camera will let them. And as we do that, we're going to start to pick up this grain, this pixelization. And all that is the fact that the camera itself, the more noise or the more light that's already on the image, and the more that we're trying to force into it, the camera can't really comprehend that. And so it'll start to make the images more clunky and staticky, if you will. This kind of reminds me of the static on the TV when there's no more signal. So depending on your light situation, you really want to make sure that you're looking at ISO and using it appropriately. That's where I think auto ISO is really nice and appropriate. I think I have the next slide. So with auto ISO, I recommend using auto ISO when you are going in between multiple settings for photography. For example, I had a mom who came in who was doing prom photos, and she said, well, my kids are taking pictures at their friend's house, then they're going to be outside at this country club, and then we have another little fountain that we're taking photos by. What do you recommend for my camera settings? And I told her, honestly, focus on aperture priority. That's probably going to be the best for you to control that depth of field, that background to foreground relationship. But I told her to use auto ISO, because you're going to be going from indoors to outdoors to something with high reflection coming off of it, like a fountain. You're going to be in different situations where, with all of those things going on, light is not going to be a factor you can control, nor can you manipulate. So using auto ISO will just allow the camera to do the rest of the work for you, and you're focusing on that foreground to background relationship from the kids and wherever the environment that you're shooting them in. So to go back through the review, now again, all of these things are separate from each other, but they all coincide with each other. And my other recommendation too, if you really want to get a better feel for this, rather than jumping into full manual, if you're on aperture setting or you're on your priority setting for shutter, change one of those numbers up and focus with your camera. See how then it changes the other numbers automatically on your camera to make up for one of the decisions that you made. Typically when I shoot, I have my numbers for manual control and I have no issue with manual, but a lot of the times I will just lean on aperture or shutter because it takes guessing out of my hands. I don't have to sit there and think too hard about it. I can just focus on what I'm seeing in front of me and how I want that to translate in the photo, knowing well that I can always go in and edit later on to bring certain things out or to make things more moody or what have you. We got our two piggies on the top. Our piggies are sitting on a couch somewhere in someone's house. At f16, we can see the extra pillows in the background, the table, the corner of the wall. And as we slowly start to get down to the lower numbers, that stuff starts to blur out. I can't really make out the corner. I don't see much of the table anymore. And all I have focus on are the two pigs that are sitting in the same spot. Shutter, we can see that with the speed of which we're hitting the nail and using our hammer, at the 1 in 1,000 speed, we can see that the hammer is clean, we see the background, we see everything, and I also want to note that it's a lighter image. We can see how light everything is. As we continue to make this guy more slow, we can see that the image becomes darker. We're letting less light into the camera by changing our shutter speed, or I apologize, we're letting more light into the camera by changing our shutter speed. So by doing that, we're really slowing down what it's reading as far as the image goes. And so it'll make things look a little bit darker in there. Whereas typically the faster you go, the more light influx that comes into the camera at that time, and sometimes our images can look washed out or worn away. So using that slower speed though, our board is still in still full focus, but our hammer is blurry. Now you can barely make out that's a hand with a hammer. In this one, I would argue, you can kind of make out the fingers, so it does look like it's swinging down. And then in the 1/60th of a second, that's the only one, in my opinion, where you can see the speed, but still make out that that's a hand moving. Going down to ISO, as we move down the row on this one, we can see that at ISO 100, the penny and the wood that it's sitting on, the color is separate, but the color also looks really nice. As we move forward on the numbers, we can see that the board itself starts to become more washed out. It's this dark black wood. Now it's starting to get more grayish and a little bit more pixelated as we go. That penny is starting to also lose its shine and get a little bit more of that graininess that we were talking about. So again, using ISO, it's important to remember that it is the relationship of light with your camera. Typically, the lower the number is, the less amount of light comes in. But the higher it is, the more light that comes into it that can cause your image to either be grainy or washed out as well too. So it goes hand in hand.
What is the highest ISO you like to use?
I mean, I have taken my camera can go all the way up to 102,000 ISO. I've used that for, I did a shoot with a friend of mine one time where he wanted for an album cover that he was working on. He wanted to take a picture of a street light that really coming down and beaming on him. It was a very thin amount of light. So I kept my exposure compensation at my normal rate, but I jacked my ISO all the way up, and it looked like this very halo effect coming onto it. It was really cool. So I don't have a minimum or maximum. I will say on my Fuji camera, that's more of like my my digital film looking camera. I like to use ISO 800, and that's the highest I'll ever go on it. For me, that's mimicking about the highest I would buy film at when I was still using film. I never went higher than 800. But I would say for very dark nighttime situations, 3200 or 6400 are going to be more than enough. Those are some of the highest you can get on a lot of cameras. If you need more than that, you either probably need to look at getting a more advanced mirrorless camera, or that's when you want to look at getting flash. But again, a lot of the times, not going to lie, will just use auto ISO. I would just let it ride on the auto because for me, I'm not as concerned about the relationship with the light. If I need to change something, I'm more comfortable changing my exposure compensation to make it lighter or darker right then and there than needing to necessarily go in, change the ISO. The other thing with ISO too is that because it's more of a menu system setting, it's not something that's on the buttons of the camera. Sometimes it can be more of a pain in the butt to have to do it, and that's where I do like the FN or the customizable buttons on your camera. If you see that you have a C1 or C2 button or an FN button, you can customize that to be whatever you want, and you can make that your switch for ISO so that it's quicker to get to. Speaking of exposure meters, this is what a typical exposure meter will look like. Now, exposure is going to be the amount of dark and lightness that comes into the camera and how it fluctuates back and forth. For a lot of brands, they will just have the 0, a 1, and a 2. Some brands do it a little differently. That home plate or an upside down house. That's your home. That is the ground zero. That is when you're at 0. There is no changing that you've made to go in one direction or the other. On most cameras, they're going to go by full stops. Some more advanced cameras will have quarter stops in between or half stops in between. A one full stop will be notified either by a 1 or by a dash of some sort. So as we go in one direction, we make it lighter. As we go in the other direction, I stopped drinking coffee a little bit ago. It still hits me when I talk for too long and get going. When we go in one direction, we are adding more light to our picture. When we go in the other direction, we're making it darker. So again, depending on the stoppage and which direction that you go when you're using the camera, you'll notice that the entirety of the frame becomes dark, not just certain sections of it. It'll either become lighter or darker. And I like exposure compensation too because most cameras have one of the dials on the front of the camera to be the exposure compensation. Some cameras don't have that. Some cameras do have that one. The camera I shoot with has one on there, and it makes it really easy for me to have to change on a fly. Now, again, full manual, just to clarify again. We talked about using aperture and shutter priorities, but full manual is for the person who understands these settings on their camera, but now they want to be able to control it all themselves. And I will say that a majority of professional photographers are using stuff like this. It's really the best way to do it because it's the old school way, but it also gives you full control over the device that you have. Maybe you don't know the metering. Maybe you don't understand the focus lock. Maybe you don't understand certain settings of the camera, but if you understand that f-stop and that shutter speed and the ISO and how they relate to each other, that's the basis of what all film cameras were prior, so it shouldn't be too big of a jump to learn that. Once you get it down, you've got it for life. And the typical way that I describe it with people is I always tell them, take pictures in automatic for as long as you can until you don't feel like you're getting what you want out of them anymore. From there then, gravitate towards trying to use full manual. And if you're not comfortable with that still, try to use the shutter and the aperture priority. Just try to use one by itself. It gives you the idea of what that setting does. So when it is time or you are ready to move to full manual, you have a better control over what that means exactly and how that all works. So on the next slides here, I've got a couple images before we talk about lenses where I show and I kind of describe what I'm seeing on the image and how I would relate that to your f-stop, to your shutter, and to your ISO. I'll also throw in some terminology that I used last week, like our horizon line and points and all that other stuff. So looking at this one, we have a horizon line that is cutting right across the image right about there. So right about the center where the bridge kind of ends back. And the reason being is that if we took a ruler and we tried to draw lines to where everything is pointing to, we'll notice that it's all going to converge onto one small point all the way in the background. And that is our way of viewing things. That's how humans see things. That's how drawers also get that kind of perspective drawn when they're doing art, especially with landscape or building photography. But when it comes to what I'm seeing in the photo, we can see everything's converging into a single point in the center. We have this bridge that opens up nicely here. Now, for the ISO, I think the ISO is a little bit high. And the reason I think that is because when I look at certain areas like underneath the ducts there on the bridge, I could see the graininess of the image. So their ISO is probably a little too high for this image, maybe somewhere around 400 to 800. And the reason I'm seeing that too is because the lights are looking a little bit washed out. They're very powerful. They're very bright. Aperture-wise, though, I think this was wide open, definitely something closer to a 22 or a 16, because you're able to see everything in complete focus on there. Even the stuff on the bottom floor, like the car or that construction equipment over there, it's all there. Shutter speed wise, I don't think this would have been very fast because it is a landscape photography photo. So it's probably something that is maybe 1/100th of a second, maybe 1/125th of a second, but probably no faster than that. Also no slower than that too. And the reason being for that is, as much as I can see the details and everything else in the brick, I don't think this was a long exposure. The cherry blossoms here, we can see that they used an aperture probably closer to 5.6 or to f4, because we can, just like the dogs, make out the background enough to know that those are other cherry blossoms. But the main focus are basically this set of branches right here and a little bit of this one that's off to the side. It starts to get more blurry as we get to the butt of the stem, but it's nice and open at the tops. From there, ISO would probably be really low too, maybe 100, no higher than that, maybe auto ISO as well too. Shutter speed, probably also very low too. 1/100th of a second, maybe 1/125th of a second. Unless this is a very windy day and the branches are moving back and forth violently, which, just judging by the blue sky and how clear things look, I don't think that would have been the case. Otherwise too, you would see a lot more blur on the photo. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing on that one. We have our two firemen, one in front of the other. Now we can see this fireman in complete detail, and just like the dog photo, we can see that the fireman behind him is blurred. It's blurred out. Now, with that being said, we can see the fireman's in full detail, but while we can't really make out exactly behind them, we can tell by the detail of the helmet and what they're wearing here and everything else that it is another fireman. We can't tell if they're looking directly at us or if they're looking at him or if they're looking maybe off to the distance somewhere. So that's where we start to lose it. Unlike the dog that we saw before, we were able to make the dog out and just kind of see where those directions the eyes were going a little bit more. We can see the jowls, the pink collar, and we have similar details on this, but I would be tempted to believe that this is closer to f4, maybe even f2.8, but f2.8 might be a little too blurry. Now, as far as ISO goes, it looks like this is pretty well lit, but judging by the color of the light, I'm kind of getting the same feeling I get in this room where we have these more orangey, warm tone lights. So the ISO on this one probably could have been 200 to 300, just judging by the darkness of the image and how the wrinkles and everything else show a lot of dark coloration to them. But at the same time, this could have been done with a 100, but I would probably put more my money towards a 200, 300, just to bring in a little bit of extra light given how warm these tones are. Sometimes they're a little harder to capture than colder light. And as far as shutter goes, unless these guys are walking towards our subject matter, it's probably going to be like a 100, or if they are moving, maybe a 200 or 250 for the shutter speed. But nothing too fast, nothing too slow. Then you got this ram's head. Now, I had this debate with a bunch of people in the last class. I can't tell if this is a stuffed ram or if this is a real ram. When they asked why I think it might be stuffed, if you ever go to the Field Museum, you'll notice that they have like little setups for everything behind their animals. So in my mind, I'm like, this could just be a really nice, elaborate setup for that. But anyway, you can see the detail in the fur and in the horns. So this is a really nice camera that whoever's using is using on this one. When we look at this image, we can see how dark things look. Whether it's the fur over here, whether it's whatever this little piece is over there. It could be even as simple as underneath the horn too, where we're getting that intense shadow that's coming from the drop down of the horn. So I probably would put my ISO a little bit higher, maybe closer to a 800 or a 600 ISO, just given how dark the image is. We probably want to bring more light into this. We do have a light source kind of coming from the top, it feels like, because the top of the horns feel very lit. His back or their back feels very lit. The front of the face feels very lit. But then we can see on the drop side, that's where we're starting to get more dark from. So my theory on the light is that it's coming from the top. As far as aperture goes, the background is slightly blurred, but I believe this is a tree trunk of some sort. I can tell that there's broken sticks and shrubs on the floor, snow. That would make the most logical sense because it's white. So I probably would put the aperture closer to maybe a f5.6, maybe an 8 at the highest, because there is a good amount of blur, but you can still make out what you see there. As far as shutter goes, unless this is a moving real animal, I would imagine it's at a slower shutter speed. 1 in 125th of a second, 1 at 100 of a second. I don't think it's anything faster than that.
I don't think it's real.
No, I don't think it's real either. No. It's a beautiful, beautiful ram, but it just doesn't look, yeah, I don't think it's real. I think it's in a museum
The
somewhere.
eyes.
Yeah, the eyes don't look, yeah. Just the clarity of that too. I've heard they're nasty animals, that they'll really come after you and start headbutting you if you get way too close. And I'm okay, I don't really want that. Then real motion on this one. So you've got two dogs, you got probably at a park, they're playing frisbee with their owner. The photographer in this case took a very quick, fast shot of the animal, but just like we were talking about earlier, to capture motion, they're probably going to be somewhere closer to, I personally say 1/1500th of a second or 1 2,000th of a second. Only reason being is that when a dog or any other animal gets like this in the air and is flying through, you're probably going to have more speed or more, velocity to the animal, if you will. To get their body to be thrown like this, especially on all 4 legs, that's not just a quick gallop, that's real fast. So the speed of your camera is definitely going to have to be greater. Now, from there, the background is nice and blurred. So that leads me, especially on this image, to believe we're closer to that f-maybe 1.4, maybe 2.8, depending on if this is a zoom lens. From there, though, we can still make out parts of the background, or parts of the foreground with the animal, so we can see where our focus kind of hit. And as far as ISO, these aren't very dark images, so I probably would put the ISO somewhere closer to 1 100th of a second, or sorry, at 100 ISO, just because there's a good amount of light at the park. Probably doesn't need, you can see the shadows coming from the dogs, so you can tell the sun is coming from above and hitting. Same thing on this one, the sun is kind of pitched up on the right side there and hitting the dog, so you see everything on the floor. I think this is one of the last ones I have before we talk about lenses. You have the football player jumping into the end zone. This can be your kid, your grandkid, and you're trying to get the best image possible. From this viewpoint, I can definitely tell that whoever's taking the photos on the sidelines watching the game, they're not shooting from far up in the stands, which I'll talk about a lens that's probably better for that when we get there. But we can see the speed at which they're jumping in. If they're diving in, it probably means that they've just avoided some tackles or they're trying to avoid some people. We can see the shadow over on the corner there, so my imagination is someone standing over there who was trying to tackle him before he got into the end zone. But with the jump, we're in motion, so we're definitely looking at least 1 1,000th of speed, possibly a little bit faster, but even with football players, they're fast, but they're probably not fast enough that like a dog would be, or like a hummingbird would be, or even maybe a surfer. But even then, the surfer probably isn't going as fast as our dog and our hummingbird. Now, we can see that they're in good focus, but the background's slightly blurred out. I probably would put that closer to an f8, maybe an f11, because we can still make out the background. We can read that that's player number 6, but it's blurred enough that we can't see the fine details. But we can see where the mouth guard is. You can kind of make out the nose there. So there's definitely details there. Enough details that I don't think it's a 5.6 or lower. I would definitely put it above that. As far as ISO goes, again, probably using ISO 100, maybe ISO 200, but nothing too crazy because we have so much sunlight coming down. We don't need to ruin our images with grain or blur. One more image. Now, this one, it took me a while to figure out what this was, but this is a long exposure. And in my opinion, this is an example of a long exposure where the settings weren't proper on this one. So first things first, the ISO is definitely not the best on the camera, and that's why we're getting these intense light flares. So we have a high ISO mixed with a long exposure shot. So we've got two things working against us. When we do a long exposure, we want to have a lower ISO number. If I probably was looking at this photo, I would probably guess that ISO was somewhere closer to 800. Whereas if you're doing a long exposure, you probably want to keep it at the lowest, which I believe is 100, could be 50 as well too. From there though, I can see it's long exposure because I have these red lines that are running across behind this guy, and I can tell it's a train station. It's a little terminal to walk through on there. You got some warning lines on the step down below where the tracks would be, and these red lines that are cutting across have to be the tail end lights of our train, and the rest of the lights that are on there. Our main focus on this photo is most likely going to be this bike, and I would probably say that the center of the bike is where I'm seeing the most focus on. So ISO I think is too high, somewhere around 800 to 600. I would say that the shutter speed is long exposure because we have the blurred lines going across. And as far as aperture goes, it feels like this would be closer to like maybe an f11 or f16 because the background is not fully blurred out, but it's blurred out enough that you really can't necessarily see it crisp on the page. That also could be from the light flare that we're getting. It's deflecting a little bit and making it harder for our camera to focus in on the rest of the buildings. Because if you do notice, the pipe that the bike is chained to is in perfect focus for the most part. So again, I would probably lean at a higher f-stop number for non-background blur, so probably 16 to 11. So again, learning your camera is only the first step to this whole thing. It's the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. And you can always come and take these classes literally as many times. I had someone who came, I think, 3 or 4 months in a row and did the same schedule that I had. And at some point I kind of had to have a conversation with them and not say that they couldn't come anymore, but more to say it's pointless to take the classes and it's pointless to learn this stuff if you're not putting it into action. So get out there, take photos, practice with the camera, become more comfortable with it, because it's the only way you're really going to make sense of what this all is. My best practice that you can do is just to go out and practice. If you're going on a vacation and you're leaving the country, the state, you're just going to visit a friend who lives, in Wisconsin, right across the border, bring your camera with you and play with it. That's the best way you can use it. I love being the friend in my group that anytime we go out, I always have a camera on my neck, and everyone looks at me like I'm silly, but I'm capturing memories and moments that we can have forever, number one. But then number two, I'm learning more about my camera, how it reacts in certain lighting in certain situations, and it's really fun to get to experience that. Classes are a great other way to do it. My class is wonderful. If you can get into other classes, I know community colleges do free, or not free, but non-credited classes, so you can learn at your own pace. YouTube channels, just YouTube in general. I laugh. I am a glorified plumber in my family. I can fix almost any leak. I have no plumbing skills. I have no plumbing background. I learned everything on YouTube from the ages of maybe like 15 to 18, and I'm a real good plumber. I can fix any leak that I see. Workshops are great too. I had a gentleman who was in the class who actually signed up to do a workshop where he paid an instructor to teach. This instructor was teaching a full workshop about how to photograph cactuses. So he flew out to Arizona for a week, and that's what he did. I'm waiting to actually see some of the images that he did, because I know he left and then he was going to stay out there for vacation for I think a month. But again, getting a part of that too, and then just travel. Go out and travel, and if you don't have your camera, you're making a mistake. Bring your camera with you. The phone is great when you're traveling and you're doing stuff. I know it's not as cumbersome as a camera, but from everything that we're talking about now, there's a reason you upgraded from your cell phone into a more advanced camera. Whether that's something that you remember from when you were younger and starting photography, or whether that's something that you're learning right now as you've been taking photos and you realize that the phone is just not what a camera can be, bring your camera with you. You won't regret it. And I talk about recommended accessories again before we really get into lenses and anything else, but I think that for anybody who's getting into it, you really only need the top 4 things to get started. Get a bag to store everything, have your extra battery, have an extra memory card, get a lens cleaning kit. And I strongly recommend this. Never use your shirt or cloth to clean this thing. because you can damage your lens. And I use this quote on the next line, or in a couple slides that'll make more sense, but I take pictures for the Chicago Polar Bear Club every year for the Polar Plunge, and every time, without fail, I've got my waders on, I'm sitting in cold water, it's freezing, temperature's like -6 outside, and I'm just sitting there taking pictures of people jumping in their skimpies into the water. I'm freezing, but when that water splashes up and hits the lens, it'll almost freeze on contact. So I have to have a cloth kit that I can just start wiping it away, otherwise my photos won't focus, they'll be blurry, they're not gonna look right. Same thing if you go on vacation. All it takes is for one bug to fly into your camera lens, and they might smear it up a little bit. Have a cloth that you can clean it, a little microfiber cloth, a little spray, never hurts. A camera strap is pretty necessary too. I think everyone should have that. It's a great way of walking around with your camera. If you have neck problems, there are other ways to go about it, but strap's definitely worth it. Get a tripod if you think it's necessary. If you like the long exposure, they're great to have. An external hard drive, we talked about that last week. Having an ability to store your photos in multiple places is great. Additional filters like a polarizer filter or an ND filter are great, especially if you take pictures of things with high glare or bad shine. And then additional lenses. And that's where we talk about what lenses really mean. Now, this is my favorite expression. I tell this to everybody who is getting into photography for the first time. Date your body, marry your glass. Your lenses will last forever if you take good care of them. They really should not deteriorate. But every time you take a picture with your camera body, it's a ticking clock. They have what's called shutter counts on the cameras. And after a certain period of time of using your camera over and over and over again, the shutter becomes worn out. It starts to not be able to close as fast. It's not as crisp as it once was. It's delayed slightly. So, 10, 15 years down the road, you put 50, 60,000 shots, probably even more than that, on your camera body, it's going to start to underperform from what you're used to. That's when it's probably time for you to upgrade into the next camera body. However, by doing that, it's important to remember that if you are taking good care of your glass, you can move that glass over to the next camera, especially if you stay in that same category. If you don't, for whatever reason, they make a lot of adapters to bring your Canon lenses to a Sony camera, or Sony to a Nikon, or even Leica to some of these other ones if you're a Leica fan. So date your body, marry your glass. When you're investing in cameras, your glass should be somewhere between, I'd say, 60 to 90% of your purchase. In a lot of the cases, your camera, if you buy a camera that's a couple $1,000s, do not be surprised if your lenses cost the same amount or if they cost slightly less. Very common. Focal length and zoom are the same thing. Yet, however, when we read these, we see the numbers written in millimeter sizes. Now, I've done research on this. There's a lot of different conflicting opinions on why it is that cameras develop a millimeter system for their lenses. But the key to it is that millimeter, in this case of the zoom, does not equate to the size whatsoever. You're not moving at 70 millimeters when you go to 70 millimeters. You're not moving at 105 millimeters when you do. That is their unit of measurement for, again, multiple different reasonings that I couldn't find one exact on. 70 millimeters, at least in this case, we have more of a landscape shot. We're getting the entirety of it, some mountains in the background, some buildings, this kind of marshy swamp area. We have a pack of seagulls right there, or however you call it, plural form of seagulls. Move over to 105, we're starting to cut out some of that negative space. We don't have nearly as much wide open sky, it's not as wide. We're getting closer to those buildings over there too, and the mountains as well are starting to become more prominent. Move to 200, and now we've actually cut out the buildings in the back corner there. The mountains are much more closer, and on top of that, our subject matter is closer too. And then moving to 400, the birds are in focus, but now look at how close our background is to us. So it's important to remember that as you start to zoom in, not only will your subject matter become closer, but your background-foreground relationship is going to change. It's kind of like when you look at your rear view mirror and it shows some objects might be closer than they appear. That's exactly what you're seeing within the lenses. And I have this little GIF that illustrates that when it comes to compression. So you can see that at certain numbers on this image, the boy's face goes very narrow and then it becomes very plump. The smaller the number is, the more narrow, the wider our angle is. And you can see that our main subject being the boy, really his nose is what pops out, and then his face becomes skinnier. But the background is important to pay attention to as well, because you can see how compressed and how forward or how back that background goes when we're doing something so wide or so small on the number. As we then zoom in, the subject matter is not moving at all. He's not going anywhere. He's standing in the same exact spot, but that background is coming closer and then going back when we go down to the smaller number. So that's an important thing to remember too. On top of that, with our subject matter, we can see how much more distorted or how much more maybe chunky the face becomes. I like to say it that way because, again, for so many people, if you're doing portraits or beauty shots, your goal might be to make sure your subject matter stays in as perfect of a form as possible. And compression can come in as you're zooming and changing stuff. But again, if you have, let's say, you're on a safari and you see the lions in the distance, you can't walk up to the lions and take a picture of them to avoid compression. You have to zoom in. So that's where understanding it really comes into effect. Lenses that you're going to see on the market. So these are very common lenses that you'll see out there nowadays. And then we'll talk about the trinity of lenses, the most important ones. So your kit lens. Your kit lens is going to be pretty standard with the camera. That's what you're going to see if you buy a camera with a lens. As you maybe become more advanced, as you're ready to maybe upgrade your camera body, you might not necessarily buy a camera with a lens. You might just buy what they call body only. That's a great way of then you being able to bring in your better lenses or high quality lenses while saving maybe $400 to $500 typically off the purchase price. 18 to 55 is the size of the lens. That's going to be more of a zoom, or it's going to be telephoto, if you will. But the nice part with this is that you're getting a wide angle with 18, and 55 would be considered your portrait. The human eye we naturally see in 50 millimeters. That's the easiest way to put that. So if you're taking a picture with 50, that is the same as the natural human eye. Now, the next number to really be focused on is the number right up there where it says 3.5 to 5.6. Typically on a kit lens, it's not the best glass. It's an entry level for you to really get into everything. So the kit lenses typically have a maximum aperture of whatever the number they have written on there is. So in this case, 3.5 to 5.6. So the way that you look at this is if your lens was engaged to 18, the lowest or maximum number you could have is 3.5. When we talked about aperture before, we talked about that 2.8, that 1.8, 2. You will not be able to hit that number with this lens because the maximum it can go, or the highest or lowest, if you will, that it can go is 3.5. Now, kit lenses, to save on cost, have what they call a variable maximum aperture. So as you start to then turn the lens to 55, you want to zoom in slightly more, that 3.5 is going to go away. And now the lowest you have is 5.6. So understanding that is important, and that's what separates the kit lenses from more advanced lenses. Typically, it's the coating levels that the lens goes through, the different levels of coating that they have on the physical glass to help with reduction of glare, fog, and other unwanted textures. But the other big thing is that the maximum aperture usually increases. 2.8 is a really sought after number, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, those are big numbers too. Now your nifty 50 or your prime lens. That's going to be probably one of the most important lenses that you have in your collection, and I always recommend having one prime lens. Now the reason they call it the nifty 50 is because for a long period of time, before they really were doing more advanced work with the lenses, you typically only had a 50 millimeter lens on your camera. So the nifty 50 was the best lens to have at the time. It still is a really sharp and powerful lens. Anyone who does portrait photography or just does still photography, I think you need a 50. Or at least a 35 or an 85 also works really well. Those three are great. But we call those prime lenses. And the reason we call them a prime lens is because it can be only one number. Telephoto lenses move, they're variable lenses. At 18 to 55 is a short telephoto. The 50 millimeter would be a prime lens. It's one single number. Definitely something I would recommend having. And then we look at bigger telephoto zooms. Now, typically with these bigger telephoto zooms, they are going to be lenses with a higher maximum f-stop. So for Canon, one of their big selling points is that if you see a red ring across their lens, that is their top of the line glass. That's their L series lens. Typically, if it is a prime lens, it'll be as low as a 1.2, 1.8. If it's telephoto, it'll typically be at a 2.8. So again, 2.8 with these telephoto lenses is about the highest or most maximum number you're going to get out of the aperture. And the only reason being is that if it were any lower, the ring or the circumference of that front end glass would have to be so much more wide, adding a lot more weight and a lot more zeros to the end of the price tag on these lenses. Now, to be fair, the G Master over here, that's Sony's lens, you can always tell that they are their top of the line if they have that golden G on there, or that orange G. This is still a $3,500 lens, and this is still probably somewhere close to $2,000. So lenses aren't cheap, and that's something to remember too. Telephoto lenses specifically are not cheap because of how much glass is on the inside there. It's a very sophisticated lens. But telephoto lenses, they zoom just like a lot of kit lenses do, but they're telephoto because they basically telescope in and out, and on top of that too, they are not a prime lens because they don't have one variable number. Yeah, prime lens versus zoom lens, I kind of just explained it right there. I forgot I had the slide. Prime lens, single number. Typically, it's going to be the lowest, or it's highest maximum aperture that you're going to get. So prime lenses are where you're going to see that 1.2, 1.4, 1.8. Zoom lenses are where you're going to see that 2.8, or you might see an f4, or you might see that it's a variable zoom depending if it's a kit lens. I might have one more. No. The other thing that I like to tell people too with these, a prime lens, you physically have to move yourself depending on your subject matter. If I wanted to photograph you and I didn't like how that frame looked, I would either have to get closer or I have to back myself up. And that could be a problem depending on the environment or the space that you're in. Telephoto lenses are better for that then, because instead of moving yourself, just zoom your lens in slightly or zoom out slightly to change the frame. The last lens, which I already gave you a little hint about, was your travel lens. A travel lens is that they become very popular for people who want to not bring 5 different lenses or 3 different lenses with them when they go on vacation. They can bring one lens, and typically the lens will be a big number. So this one goes from 18 to 135. So 18 being very wide, 135 being pretty broad in and tight. That's great for people who don't want to buy another camera. Typically these lenses are not very expensive. They're inexpensive, maybe $500 to $600 for the most part. Compared to other lenses, that's a pretty fraction of the cost. But where the detail gets lost in this one is its maximum f-stop, 3.5 to 5.6. It's pretty standard for that. Because again, for that to have that big of a range, your lens would have to be wide. Not pizza wide, but pretty wide. The other thing too is that with that lower aperture level, it's usually a slower lens in the sense, so it might not necessarily be the quickest or the fastest, but for example, I had a couple that was going to go on safari, and they asked about getting a travel lens like this one, and I recommended it highly, and I told them though, when you're done using it, you're really only going to want to use this in situations where there's a lot of light, because it's very hard sometimes with that amount of zoom that it has to take in a lot of light. So places like Africa, where the sun is nice and bright all the time, you'll get really great photos. But if it's a cloudy, rainy day, maybe you decide to go hiking in Seattle, that's when I probably would be a little weary of this lens. Even though you will get good shots, that overcast, that cloud, it might affect the final quality. And then what lenses do you need? And I put quotations around need because I'll be honest with you, for the longest time I only shot with the 50mm, and on my Fujifilm camera that I love so much, I only shoot with a 35. I rarely ever bring a telephoto lens out with me, but when you look at these, this is the Trinity. So they consider this the Trinity. If you're getting a lens and you need to get, the main setup, these are the 3 lenses you should be getting. So you should always have a prime lens. Prime lens is going to be your go-to. That's going to be where you get the best aperture on there, best background to foreground separation. This is your professional camera lens. 24 to 70 is, in my opinion, one of the best lenses any photographer can get. And the reason being is that 24 is nice and wide, 70 really gets you into that portrait mode, and I think that's a really great lens. You get that wide angle action into a little bit more portrait, everything in between. If you can afford something like the L series or whatever the top of the line, the G Master, the Nikkor, that's going to give you a really nice maximum f-stop too, so you get that 2.8 on there, and the blur that you can get from the background and your focus on your subject matter is beautiful. My 50 millimeter that I shoot on goes all the way down to, I believe, 1.4, and it's great the detail I can get on there, but when I'm here in the store, I'll put a 24 to 70 on my camera, and it's just really nice, that zoom that I'm able to get. And the last one, 70 to 200. Now, I would put that lens under quotations because I don't think everyone needs something like a 70 to 200, but it's great because it picks up right where your 24 to 70 left leaves off, but then its distance is really what you're after. Good distance for you to see your subject further away, great zoom, and a lot of the times you can get that 2.8 glass, so again, same as the 24 to 70, you're getting a really nice background to foreground relationship. Now the downside to using something like this is the weight. The lenses that are 70 to 200, 100 to 400, they are going to weigh a lot. So if you've got problems with holding something like that or having it around your neck, keep that in mind, because then that's where probably having something like the travel lens is more appropriate because it's lighter, not as much glass, so on and so forth. The trinity of lenses. This is the go-to that I tell everybody to get. And that's all I got for you guys today. Again, sorry for starting a little bit late. I know we're getting close to 7 o'clock now, but advanced cameras will be this Monday for anybody watching online. I'll be out of town for a camera convention from Tuesday to Thursday, so I won't be here. I'll be in Kansas City. I'm very excited about that. Never been. But next week we're going to do it on Monday, same time, 5:30 to 7, and I'll get you guys going through that. But yeah, anybody who's got questions, I know no one chatted away online, but email me, call me if you have anything else. And for everybody in class today, does anybody have any questions today?
One that we were talking about before, I have a feeling which way you go. I have a UV filter that I keep on my camera just because I know that sooner or later I'm going to hit that sucker. And yes, I have the lens cleaner, cleaning kit and all that, but what do you think of having that on your camera all the time?
Perfect. Totally fine.
Oh, because some people are like...
Some people are particular because they think it'll distort or changes the color or it'll alter things. But I'll be honest with you, that $10, $15 UV filter isn't really filtering out a lot of light. If you're buying the $90, $100 HGX filter that is picking up certain color profiles in there, that is blocking out ultraviolet rays.
Yeah, no, I'm looking at it as it's glass.
It's protection. It's protection.
Yeah.
I have UV filters on all of my lenses, and funny enough, I had a mom who came in and she was doing lacrosse games and she dropped her lens. It looked bad. She came in and she had tears in her eyes. She's like, "My husband's gonna kill me." And I'm like, what happened? She showed me the lens, and it was a big crack going down it, but she couldn't get the filter off because she was scared she'd cut herself. And she smacked it on there. As soon as we took the UV filter off, the lens was perfect. No issues underneath.
Oh, and I thought because when you were talking about shooting, with the crazy people, that you did not have a UV on it.
No, and I always do, especially when I do the polar plunge when they're jumping in and stuff. Yeah, they are crazy for the most part. I always keep a UV filter on there, and all I do with my little kit is just wipe the lens down, so that way I get the fog and all the grease from the water and everything else off. But yes, I'm a fan of UV filters. For anybody online, I strongly recommend putting a UV filter on there. Not necessarily to help with the ultraviolet rays from the sun and anything else, but for protection most importantly. Respect your glass, take care of it, and that's one of the best ways to ensure you don't scratch anything on the front. The only other thing I could say too is that there is a little butt cap that goes onto your lens that protects the lens bayonet system. When you're taking the lens on and off, put that on as soon as possible. Same thing with the sensor cap on the camera. Don't separate them and leave them off from each other and scramble to find it. Have everything in front of you when you're putting it on, and do it by clean surfaces. If I'm out on a shoot and let's say I'm outdoors for it. Before I start shooting, I'll assemble everything when I get to the event, and I'll do it in my car, just so that way it's ready to go and I didn't get any dust or any other debris in there. From there, though, if I need to switch lenses, I do it like the Roadrunner. I try to be very quick to get it on so that I avoid keeping any stuff on the insides.
I was just going to show you one that I had picked up at a camera shop.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. So you got the little
It's very
tightener
cute.
screw for it, the spray on there, and then the cloth itself. That is perfect.
And then I got my little dust buster.
I like
on
that
the
little
side.
little
Yeah.
squeeze guy.
Yeah.
I love that. I like the little keychain too.
Well, you can tell I've used it unfortunately a few times because they said, no, don't use just the microcloth, spray it first.
It is nice to spray it first because you do get that debris off there. Because some people, they'll see a smudge on their lens and they'll take the cloth and they'll just keep going and going and going. And not to say it's bad, but you're not. It's like having a bidet. We put bidets in my house not long ago, and one of the jokes that we said was like, if a dog had a mess on your foot, you're not just gonna take a cloth and wipe it off. You're gonna wash it a little bit, but then, so
Oh.
same idea.
I was going to show you this. It was one of the first pictures I took with this one point and shoot. And what happened is, you can actually see through the guy because you can see the trees and
Yeah.
branches and everything else is that weird?
Yeah, a little bit of movement there.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, it was just kind of,
Yeah. So however it picked it up, it got the movement on there.
it was a plane crash right across the street because I'm near Milwaukee.
Oh my goodness. Oh,
Yeah.
that was on the news. I saw
Oh, no,
that.
this was
Oh, yeah,
what
okay.
year, we have them regularly.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm like, okay, it's not a ghost because the pilot walked away,
Yeah.
but it's just weird because that's the only thing that's,
That's funny, yeah, that one's gonna move. However, the camera captured it. I bet the camera's focus was over on the plane, and then when this person was walking through, they were moving fast enough that when the shutter went, that's you could like literally see through them. It's the same thing like when you look at the train pictures where the train is moving at
Mhm.
high speed and all you see are the lights. It's not the fact that the train wasn't there. It's just however the camera picked it up at that exact time, it was moving.
I was trying to take pictures of the guys when I was getting really mad because I hadn't set it for burst
Mm-hmm.
shot or anything, and I would take one, camera would not shoot the second one, and there wasn't anything to focus on at that
No.
point. Everything was solid white, and
Yeah.
it just went, I'm done.
Yeah. If you don't do burst, it takes a little bit for the camera to load and like reconfigure itself a little bit. So
Yeah, that's my favorite picture.
I like that. I like that. You could say it was a ghost. I'd believe you if you said it was a ghost.
Oh, at one time we were trying to figure out if it was because of all the accidents, but
Yeah. Right. Any other questions for you guys? Anything else I could answer for you? I know that you'll be out of town next week.
I'm good. Yeah, I'll be out of town. I might come Monday.
Yeah,
Let's see if
absolutely.
I can make it.
Yeah, if you got time. If not, you have my information. Email, call me, whatever you got. If anything pops up.
Yeah, I can come the next month too.
Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about using YouTube to find some videos about
Yeah.
stuff. One of the things after I got this camera was I was totally overwhelmed by the menus on this. There are so many menu pages, and then there's so many choices on each page, and so many options. I was like, oh, this is terrible. But I happened to find a video that's 2 hours long, and he goes through every setting on the camera, and he explains real quickly,
Yeah.
a sentence or two about each setting, and it made so much. And he had it, hooked up to the video stream, so he could show you how it changes and what
Yeah.
it did and stuff. So that is like so good. I can go back and watch a section if I want. I can take my time in it and not, do more than 20 minutes at a time or whatever it is, not get overwhelmed. So
It's
that's
nice.
cool.
it's very convenient.
It's really, again, so people that love cameras, they will talk about cameras until they're blue in the face. They love these things. And when people are comfortable with whatever camera they own,
Yeah.
they can go into so many details about it.
And it was, for this specific model of this
Exactly.
specific camera. So it was exactly what I had. So
Yeah.
it was perfect.
Yeah.
So
I got a dummies book,
There you
but
go.
some of it's still,
well, I'm good. So I'm going to take
Good
off.
stuff.
So thanks
Anytime.
again. Maybe
Yeah,
I'll see you
we'll go
Monday.
for it,
Maybe I'll
guys.
see you.
Absolutely. Monday I'll be here.
October.
Please come. And yeah, we'll go for advanced. That's going to be more photo editing, but we'll have fun with it.
All right. All right, you take care.
You too. Enjoy your weekend.
All right.
I really thought you were gonna say no to the UV filter. I was surprised. Well, no, cause I mean, I've talked to some people that do a lot of it.
And they're just against it. No, I
Very
get
much so.
I've had it's the same type of people, in my opinion, who would have a problem with DSLRs and mirrorless. You get a lot of people that'll just, they stand by DSLRs. That's the traditional way of doing it. The mirror flips up and everything else. But when you compare the two together, mirrorless is that's, I hate to say superior, but it is a lot better.
I had called Nikon before I bought, and I said, this is what I am looking for. I like having the viewfinder just because I can see.
Yeah.
And at that point, they said, you definitely want to get the DSLR.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, it was within a month of when they were phasing it all out.
Yeah.
But
That electronic viewfinder is like, they did the math on it. It is like 0.00001% off of what the traditional
well, when I
is.
was looking, I don't think they had a model that had it on there,
Yeah.
or within my price range. Because I do more, I'm on vacation, yes, I'm mad when I don't get the shot.
Yeah.
You know, the same thing you were saying, you know, the regret, but I know the amount that I use it, and that's why I was
Yeah.
making that choice.
You gotta get what the best for you.
By the way, the other
Yes.
thing I learned from YouTube, how to remove a broken key from a lock.
Ooh.
It is the coolest thing. I did it at my sister's mailbox. Mom kept jiggling and it broke off.
Yeah.
And I have tools at home. I
Yeah.
like tools. And what you do is, you just have to know which side the teeth are on.
Okay.
You know, spray WD-40, take a saw blade,
Ooh.
have the teeth facing you. And what
Okay.
you do is you just slide the
And then
blade in and straight
pop it
out.
I love
Because
that.
the teeth grab the teeth. And it was like,
That's
is
clever.
is
I like
that the coolest
I like
thing
that.
ever?
We, funny enough, I was really bored one night, and my friends and I said we're each gonna get a skill. We're each gonna get good at something. So I learned how to juggle, and I learned how to juggle right off YouTube. So I could do 3 items at a time, but I could.
No, mine is 1, 2, 3 shit.
Yeah.
You know. Well, normally it's 1, 2.
Yeah, literally.
Oh, and the other thing, they don't tell you this on YouTube. Do not try to juggle when there's a ceiling fan,
Oh yeah.
because it was batter up right into the blinds. It was
So,
really,
yeah,
it was
it-
perfect
it was-
timing. It came up, and as it came down, it went.
I was gonna. Yep, that sounds about right. Yeah, someone's gonna.
But they were the soft ones.
Yeah.
But no, I can't keep them in the same plane.
Okay.
And you have to be able to keep them in
It took
the
me
same
a
plane.
while. I started small tidbit, but I started with cloth. Took this a
Yes.
little bit, and you basically just
Yes.
juggle like this.
They're little scarves.
That's how I first learned, and it
It
made it
was one of the
so
first-
much easier.
It was one of the first idiot books or
Yeah.
dummy books.
Okay.
And yes, I have that one, and it's different colors, and you grab it coming down.
Yeah.
I even took a class,
That's
and it's
funny.
like, but I could not.
Just couldn't get the time. Yeah, the
No.
planes. Yeah, no, I get it.
I used the hackety sack little
Yeah.
things. Was no, I
Yeah.
nope.
I got up to I could do bottles of beer.
Really?
I
I
could-
thought you were gonna say bottle caps at first.
No,
which
I
is-
can do quarters. I can do really small things, but I could actually time it where I could throw it up and it would spin, and I could catch it on the neck. And I was doing it, and I have no clue how I got the timing for it, but I figured out exactly where to like grab and release. So
Yeah, and my problem, as I said, I couldn't keep it in the plane, so one was always
yeah,
just, and you don't have the time to.
to move. I know.
Hey,
We all learn.
I know, but now you know how to get a key out.
Exactly, and now I'm gonna watch out for
And
ceiling
I'm glad
fans.
you liked my picture.
Oh, I did.
That was one of my,
great.
hey, it was a fluke.
Oh, exactly.
Anyhow, thank you.
Have a great night. Be safe. Great seeing
too.
you. All right. Doesn't look like anybody online has any questions for me, so I will close out of this as well too. Thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate having you guys. As always, keep taking pictures. Keep staying vigilant. Next week, Monday, I will be teaching the class again, so I'll be here. And if anything comes up, you guys have my phone number, my email. Reach out, give me a call anytime, and I'll be able to answer your questions.